Hello and welcome to the Holyrood Sources podcast, where we take you inside Scottish politics. I'm Calum Macdonald, and also on the podcast, Geoff Aberdein, who was Chief of Staff to the First Minister Alex Salmond. Hello, Geoff.
Good morning.
And Andy Maciver, who was Director of Communications for the Scottish Conservatives. Hello, Andy.
Hello, both.
Welcome to the podcast. Thank you for finding us. This is the only place you need Scottish political coverage. If this is your first time here, press subscribe on your podcast app and you'll get our podcast episodes every single week. Coming up today then, Operation Branchform concludes for Nicola Sturgeon, but her estranged husband, Peter Murrell, has appeared in court charged with embezzlement. We'll give you some reaction to that. Anas Sarwar and energy. Perhaps a slight change in tone from the Scottish Labour leader. We'll assess that for you as well. And Douglas Ross has announced his departure as an MSP come the next election, for Scotland that is. He's hoping to stand again as an MP as a general election in a few years' time. We'll assess the Scottish Conservatives for you as well. You can watch all of this on YouTube. Search for Holyrood Sources to get full episodes. You can follow us on X. You can watch clips on TikTok. And you can subscribe to our mailing list for announcements first. Go to holyroodsources.com and the WhatsApp number to keep in touch, 0333 404 6507. So then, since we last spoke, the former First Minister Nicola Sturgeon has spoken of her relief after it was confirmed she will face no action in the Police Scotland investigation into SNP finances. The announcement came as her estranged husband, the ex-SNP Chief Executive Peter Murrell, appeared at Edinburgh Sheriff Court charged with embezzlement. He made no plea during a private hearing and has been granted bail. Also worth noting that police confirmed the former SNP Treasurer Colin Beattie is no longer under investigation either. Clearly, proceedings then still ongoing in the case overall, but that doesn't preclude us focusing on Nicola Sturgeon, who is now living life again. She went on to speak at the Glasgow Comedy Festival alongside her good friend Val McDermid at the weekend, 48 hours or so after the announcement that the police had stopped their investigation into her. Geoff, shall I come to you first on this? So Nicola Sturgeon is cleared as far as Operation Branchform is concerned.
Yes, she is.
And what did you make of how she... We're going to be careful about what we're saying. You'll note that on this podcast. What did you make of, I suppose, her response to it? I mean, clearly she was relieved when she spoke to reporters outside her house.
Yeah, look, when you do this podcast, and I think it's phony if we don't give our honest reflections. So I'm going to give you my honest reflections. Absolutely, she should be relieved, and rightly so. And it'll come as a relief not just to her, but to her family, her friends, and her followers, and rightly so. I just found the whole reaction to this, and including Nicola Sturgeon's reaction, just a little bit weird, if I'm being honest with you, because frankly, the perception that kind of emanated immediately was that everything was in the clear, i.e. that her, Peter and Colin Beattie had all been exonerated and no issues. But that's not the case, of course. As we know, Peter Murrell has been charged of serious financial fraud against the SNP. These are only allegations at this stage, but the police have chosen to charge him. And I just thought that there was maybe not enough recognition that whilst a very positive day for Nicola Sturgeon personally, for the party, it's quite a difficult and challenging day because party members and donors could have been the victim of a serious fraud, and also just that personal thing. Obviously, her husband of 20 years has been charged, and it kind of that didn't really seem to come across. And I know that Nicola Sturgeon's got to be careful what she says about that, obviously, but I thought maybe just an acknowledgement that this is also a challenging and difficult day as well. I thought John Swinney called it pretty well, actually, in fairness to him. He said, look, this party may have been the victim of serious financial fraud, but also said he was happy for Colin Beattie and for Nicola Sturgeon. I thought that was the right kind of balance and framing. But the wider reaction's been really extraordinary. You've got these kind of Nicola Sturgeon supporters and some SNP parliamentarians saying, what a load of nonsense. This whole thing was a palaver. Well, no, it's not, because the chief executive has been charged. And then you've got these folk who no doubt wanted Nicola Sturgeon to go to jail tomorrow saying, it's a cover-up, it's a cover-up. No, it's not, because Peter Murrell has been charged. It's like, I find the whole thing extraordinary, and I just weird. It was just, I text you guys immediately after going, am I alone here? What's going on? Like, it's crazy. So
Totally.
a really, really surreal kind of 48 hours, actually, I thought.
Yeah, surreal. Andy, would you use that word? Would you use surreal, weird? It's kind of, I think it's where, one of my observations just on the way to your answer is, this is something that has consumed Scotland and Scottish politics, and absolutely it's consumed the SNP. And it still does. It's still not completely over. It's still not completely concluded.
Yeah, I think I had two reflections on it. My first reflection was that it's important for everybody operating in and around politics to understand just how popular Nicola Sturgeon remains inside the SNP. So it goes a little bit to Geoff's point that he just made. You know, there were the sort of the operation to rescue Nicola and put her back front and centre of politics was pretty active straight away. When this happened, I mean, she is still very powerful within that political party and has a real following within the party, which I thought was, well, I think is interesting. The other reflection, though, which I suppose runs counter to that, and I'm not saying this is how it should be, but I think this is how it is, personally, my view. I think in the fullness of time, Nicola Sturgeon's legacy is not Operation Branchform. I think we talk about that as though it is the thing that Nicola Sturgeon will always be remembered for. I don't think it is. I think Nicola Sturgeon's legacy is gender recognition. That's just what I think. I'm not saying it should be or it shouldn't be. It's not a comment on what I think should be the case. I think that will be her legacy. I think her main legacy will be gender recognition and not Branchform. Just an observation, but that was my thought on it.
Which is still a negative legacy. That's still viewed in a negative light, I think. It was fair to say overall.
Well, I think it depends who you speak to, doesn't it?
Yeah.
About that.
Yeah.
I mean, I, as you know, I've raised it many times. I have and always had to have grave concerns about the gender recognition proposals. So, I mean, for me, yes, but not for everybody.
Yeah. I suppose the other thought in this is about the SNP and is about supporters, is about actual people who still have unanswered questions. As we say, the process is ongoing, and perhaps we'll be able to discuss this more fully when everything is concluded in time. But I do think that whatever happens, there surely is something of a trust issue. Geoff, do you think for the party, for supporters, that they need to be reassured?
Yeah, and I think that was why John Swinney responded the way he did. His first immediate response to the news was to say, look, the party may have been the victim of a serious financial fraud, and that's part of trying to rebuild that trust. Because actually, that's quite an important moment for John Swinney to say that, because originally the SNP were all saying this is all a load of nonsense way back when, and now he's conceding that point, and I think that's an important concession. I also think, and not to get too process driven, but actually John Swinney's been doing quite a lot of work behind the scenes to shake up SNP headquarters. There is a new chief executive in there. They've been recruiting some senior appointments. There's no doubt that he's recognised that has to be addressed ahead of the election campaign to be able to say, look, let's be honest, who out with deep pockets right now is looking at the SNP saying, I tell you what, I'll throw a bit of my spare cash that way. John needs to sort that out, because certainly one of the successes we had in 2007, and around 2007 and then 2011, was being able to appeal to a wide group of people, high net worth individuals, business organisations, businesses themselves that would give donations right now. And I'm not pretty sure those people will be looking at the SNP as a safe bet. And that's why John has had to undertake this kind of restructuring of the root and branch of the party headquarters. So no doubt a big issue. And as you rightly say, hey, listen, this isn't over yet. I'm not a legal expert, but at some point I would imagine that we're going to see what the charge sheet looks like. I suppose it depends on how Peter Murrell chooses to proceed, whether he pleads or not, or contest this case. But I think the point I'm making here is that it's not all over just yet, even now.
Yeah.
And that was the kind of point my first answer, Calum, was to say, wait a minute, guys, there's still serious process to go through here.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions that need answered, I think, and I would argue from a kind of media journalist point of view, a lot of it is in the public interest, because a lot of it concerns party supporters who are civilians. They're just normal people who will look for answers. Andy, I want to just put a comment to you from the Times as well, who had a great write-up on how the day unfolded the other day when it was announced about Sturgeon and Murrell indeed. They say Sturgeon is now clear to move on to the next phase of what even sympathetic observers consider her rehabilitation tour. I mentioned the appearance at Glasgow's King's Theatre, where 1,800 people were there. And she, of course, has got her book on the way as well, which is going to be called Frankly. So that's coming, and we can expect lots of conversation and interviews around that as well. The word rehabilitation is the one, obviously, that stands out there. Does she have an effort to put in here to rehabilitate her reputation?
I think it comes back a little bit, doesn't it, to the answer I gave before. You need to rehabilitate yourself amongst people who think that you've done something wrong, and there's a large section of the population who thinks that she has done something wrong, but that something will vary from the financial stuff, gender recognition, simply just being a nationalist. So I think the question, my view is where I think is interesting over the next year or so, and it relates to the rehabilitation, is how much does the SNP use Nicola Sturgeon in this election campaign? That, for me, is the really fascinating political question, because there are very clearly quite a number of people now who, after the news last week, went full in to that political rehabilitation, and I'm sure who would like to see Nicola Sturgeon used a lot during this campaign. I find that strategically very interesting to decide what they do on that.
Yeah, and it looks as though, I mean, she's been campaigning in these council by-elections in and around her constituency just in the last week or so. She's been out and about and quite visible, so perhaps that's an indicator of where things are going from here as well. It is fascinating. I was just going to put a bit more context on it as well for those who, I suppose, are sitting there going, what are the unanswered questions? Well, I'll read from the Times. Initial complaints that the SNP had misspent funds specifically raised and supposedly ring-fenced for a putative second referendum on Scottish independence sprawled into this examination of the party's financial history in recent years. And that's what I mean by the public interest part of this. People had donated in this context. The wild goose chase, that was the term used by Murray Foote, who was Peter Murrell's successor as chief executive, has ended with Murrell, who is referred to as the former election supremo, being accused of stealing from the party he and his wife ran as their personal fiefdom for almost a decade, is how the Times puts it. And Nicola Sturgeon, of course, was on the record saying there was no issue with the party's accounts, and as party leader, she was obliged to sign off on their accuracy. So there's questions about what happened to the nearly £600,000 raised from supporters for the referendum that never was, and they have never been forthcoming. There's also the camper van, it must be said, which remains impounded, and it's never been fully explained. So the Times quite helpfully setting out some of the additional info that remains to be
Serious
discovered.
point. We should maybe explore Holyrood Sources getting that camper van for our next tour. We could fit it out with a... No, seriously, we could fit it out with a...
I love a camper van, by the way. I mean, no word of a lie. I'm a big camper van fan. I would have it.
That would save costs,
Yeah.
and we could go around the country and go on a mobile tour.
We'll get it all wrapped.
Well, you need to find it
Holyrood
first.
Sources
that is your mission.
Right, well, I don't know how much we'd have to pay to release it from being impounded, at whatever point that may be an option, but I'm open to it. I'm open to it if anyone can help us out with that at the conclusion of all of this. There you are. Right, shall we go on? We're going to read you this quote. Put bluntly, if the choice is more expensive imports from despotic regimes like Russia or new oil and gas, then the answer must be oil and gas. Who said it? Anas Sarwar is the person who said it. Geoff, are you shocked? These are words that came out of the Scottish Labour leader's mouth. He was speaking at the New Statesman's Igniting Growth Conference in central London. He says maximising extraction from the North Sea oil is better than importing oil and gas from despotic regimes. Ending our reliance on volatile markets controlled by dictators like Putin means maximising our existing resources in the North Sea. He really does listen to this podcast, I think.
Welcome to the party, Mr. Sarwar. No, look, there's a serious point here, and I'm not going to repeat all the arguments. I've been saying this for the best part of 3 years, but the Office of National Statistics tells us for the latest data they have available in 2023 that the UK relied on £80 billion of imports, oil, gas, some coal, believe it or not, and electricity. We have the ability, there or thereabouts, to cut that in half, that imports figure, by producing our own domestic supply. That's so important because right now we are relying heavily on liquid natural gas when we can't use Norway from places like the US and Qatar. So it's just common sense, guys. We all want to get to the same destination. Let's do it in a way that protects our supply chain, protects our industry. That's going to be so important in accelerating renewables. Really welcome intervention. Let's quickly discuss the politics of this. I think John Swinney's going to be having to respond to this pretty quickly because that's the most forthright I've ever heard Anas Sarwar. But also, does this suggest, Rachel Reeves kind of changing position on this? It's one of the few industries in our country that can deliver economic growth relatively quickly because these fields are ready to be developed very quickly. And so let's wait and see. Is he getting out ahead of his UK colleagues and trying to take credit, or is he just taking a flyer because he's worried about reform? He's taking his votes and he's thinking, bugger it, I've got nothing to lose.
Well, yeah, which is, solid foundation for a political strategy as any. Go on.
Yeah, I mean, we'll talk a little bit more about this in more detail later in the podcast, but Scotland has hit the energy jackpot twice, basically. Okay, we hit it with fossil fuels, and now we've hit it again with renewables. And it would be just a generationally horrific mistake if one of the few countries in the world which had hit that jackpot twice completely failed to transition from one to the other. There are countries all around the world who would kill to be in the position that we are in with energy. And we just cannot afford to keep screwing this up. It's just too important, it's too valuable to current and future generations. And, the truth is we're just not getting this transition right. Principally, as I said last week, because we appear to fail to understand the meaning of the word transition. And of course, carbon capture and storage is very important to that word transition.
Worth mentioning that we will talk more about the above with Nick Braley, who is leading the Acorn project. He'll be on the podcast in a few minutes, actually, in the context of Grangemouth and trying to save jobs and indeed create thousands of jobs, by the way. Nick will talk to us about Acorn, which has come up frequently in our energy conversations on here. So stay with us for that. Right, I want to talk about Douglas Ross and the Tories, who perhaps deserve slightly more attention than we often give them on this pod. But Douglas Ross has announced his departure as an MSP come the election next year. He is the Highlands and Islands MSP right now. He resigned as party leader after his decision to stand in last summer's general election was criticised by colleagues. Although it's worth noting, in his departure statement, he makes clear that he wants to stand again for Westminster at the next general election, which Andy goes, some way to confirming what we all knew anyway. He prefers Westminster to Holyrood. Douglas Ross, a big loss to Holyrood, do you think?
Yeah, well, I do actually, in theory, because, as we've discussed, Holyrood needs good people, and Douglas Ross is a good person. Douglas Ross is a good politician, and he's smart, and it's a shame that he doesn't like Holyrood very much, which doesn't, because it would be good, for him to be there. We talked just there about legacy when it comes to Nicola Sturgeon, and again, these things are best judged decades in the future, and you sort of say to yourself, what will people say about Douglas Ross decades in the future? What's his Wikipedia entry, right? And actually, I think his Wikipedia entry is pretty positive, because the two main things that we will look back on with Douglas Ross, I think, is that he was a Scotland Office Minister who resigned in protest at Boris Johnson. And then he was the leader of the Scottish Conservative Party who delivered the best result in the history of devolution, better even than Ruth Davidson. Those are two facts, and those facts can't be got away from. Absolutely, there are recent controversies. The David Ducat thing was very poor. There are a lot of questions to be answered about the sort of Douglas Ross, Russell Finlay transition and how long that was going on for and all that sort of thing. He is currently thought of as being the guy who's in the place he doesn't want to be, and then he goes back to Westminster. But actually, in the end, we'll look back at Douglas Ross, and there's as much on one side of the balance sheet as there is on the other to Douglas Ross. I hope he does go to Westminster, and I think he could do a pretty good job when he's there.
I'm just quite intrigued by the gap in time between now and the next Westminster election. What do you do over 4.5 years to keep yourself relevant and electable?
Well, he's going to be a referee at a lot of the football games in between then, I would have thought. I don't have much to add to what Andy says. I think the one thing I would challenge, and it's not to be disparaging about Douglas Ross himself, is very few Scottish politicians ever get Googled or Wikipedia'd, frankly. And I suspect that in a not too distant future, many people will say, "Who's that?" Right, but I just want to make one point, and I think I've said this before. Douglas Ross's public persona when he was leader, I think, came across quite abrasive at times, and sometimes not really appealing. And yet, when we interviewed him a couple of times on our podcast, I found him top notch, really engaging, brilliant. And if he's going to come back to politics, he's not going to listen to me perhaps, but that would be one bit of advice I would give him, is just trying to marry the two a little bit better. Because he's clearly a lot more engaging guy than I think his public persona would let us believe.
Yeah. I also find it fascinating. I think we're up to about 25% of current MSPs are going to stand down. It's going to be a huge change next year.
It's going to be a case of inviting folk on the podcast and going, "Sorry, who are you again?"
Yeah. No, but that's it, exactly.
Well, listen, keep some good fodder for us, actually. Keep us relevant, I suppose.
True.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's going to be remarkable change. And hey, listen, if polls are to be believed, there's going to be a decent reform contingent in there as well. I don't think we've really got to grips yet with how different Holyrood will be post May 2026. Astonishing.
It could be a big change. And actually, on that note, Andy, I wanted to ask you about a Scotsman report this week of a Conservative MSP. This is Maurice Golden, North East Scotland MSP, accusing Russell Finlay, the party leader, of dismantling the Ruth Davidson era over the party's apparent net zero U-turn. There's been a bit of backlash for Russell Finlay from backbenchers because he backed UK leader Kemi Badenoch, who claimed the 2050 UK-wide net zero target's impossible to achieve without bankrupting the country. And so Maurice Golden saying the change of heart threatens economic growth and risks turning the party's back on the success of Ruth Davidson's leadership. He suggested the Tories are pandering to the rise of Nigel Farage's Reform UK.
Well, we've talked about the winds of Westminster blowing Anas Sarwar over the last few weeks. When it comes
sneeze
to
and they catch a cold.
I'm not going to use it. I've got other metaphors. No, listen, well, here's another one. That wind is a hurricane when it comes to Tory party, right? That's it's always been the case that it's even worse when it comes to Tory party. So it wasn't in any way a surprise. But I think there's something a little bit deeper here, though, because it's not really necessarily just about Kemi Badenoch saying it and therefore Russell Finlay followed. What it's actually about is using net zero as one of three ways to combat the rise of reform. Populism throughout the world has been based on antipathy to net zero, anti-immigration, and anti-wokery. Take from that word wokery what you wish, but we all know. And Russell Finlay is adopting those three stances as well, because that is where reform are. And there's a fundamental choice for the Tory party, both north and south of the border, which is, do you chase reform and try to take votes back that have gone to reform by effectively advocating a similar policy stance, or do you run away from them? I think it's always, to me, been pretty clear what both Kemi Badenoch and Russell Finlay will do. And the truth is that there are a number of MSPs in Russell Finlay's group who would rather see him do the opposite. And therefore, there is no real surprise to me that there are some tensions there.
Stay with us on the podcast. Coming next, we're going to speak to Nick Braley, who runs the Acorn project team. You hear us talk about it a lot. We're going to add more information for you next. Over the last couple of months on the podcast, we've been discussing the Grangemouth complex, one of Scotland's major manufacturing facilities, but it's closing, threatening 400 jobs. We've been considering on the pod what the options are for Grangemouth. You may have heard us reference Project Willow as well over the last few weeks, this £1.5 million feasibility study funded by the UK and Scottish governments, which has been considering low carbon uses for the Grangemouth site. And all of this brings us to one of Geoff's favourite topics on the podcast, which is the Acorn carbon capture and storage facility at St Fergus. In a moment, we'll speak to Nick Braley, who is leading the Acorn project team. Geoff, first of all on this, tie all of this together, because we've been talking about the kind of industrial future of Grangemouth in the context of Acorn and, of course, the transition as well. So just tie it all together for us.
Yeah, a little bit of political context. I mean, for our regular listeners, they'll remember that when we did the Remembering Alex Salmond podcast, I said that on my first day working in the parliamentary office there in Peterhead, there was a file that was labelled GoldenEye, and within that referenced the importance of carbon capture. Now, guys, that was over 20 years ago. Okay, this has been a potential project for over 20 years, maybe even longer. That's just my experience of it. And in that period, we have gone back and forth around the political knockabout between different administrations at Westminster and indeed to a lesser extent at Holyrood. And we're really now coming to, mission critical in terms of this project. And I thought it was really revealing that the Project Willow, the backed government project that could secure a future for Grangemouth, is largely, not exclusively, but largely dependent on Acorn being progressed and at pace. Now, we are in a world where we need to decarbonise. We all accept that. And we have a wonderful facility at St Fergus linked to Peterhead Power Station that has the storage sites, the aquifers in the North Sea that can really help us decarbonise, lower our carbon emissions. This seems like a no-brainer. It is Scotland's only carbon capture cluster, and it has to, in my view, be approved and at pace. Now, I don't think I should say much more, Calum, because I think our guest knows a hell of a lot more than I do on the ins and outs of this. So how about you introduce Nick with that intro?
100%. Nick, it's really good to have you on the podcast. Nick Braley, who's got more than 35 years experience in the global energy sector, by the way, and is leading the Acorn project team. Hi, Nick. Welcome.
Good morning. Great to have the opportunity to talk today.
Thanks so much for coming on. How are you feeling? Are you feeling optimistic about the future here for Acorn, for Grangemouth, for what Geoff has set out for us? Is there reasons to be optimistic?
Oh, there's huge amounts of reasons to be optimistic, and Geoff laid out a few of the fundamentals. We have a really strong cluster here. We're based in Peterhead, reutilising the St Fergus site, decarbonising the hugely important gas facilities there, using offshore stores, two existing offshore stores, the GoldenEye field, the old GoldenEye field, and an aquifer store called East May, reusing existing pipelines to provide safe storage for CO2 for geological time, millennia. We have a really strong cluster. We can be decarbonising the power station in Peterhead. As you know, Scotland's blessed with a huge amount of wind, huge wind resources coming in. Unfortunately, when the wind blows, we need to find ways to keep the lights on, and a decarbonised power station at Peterhead will spring into action when the wind doesn't blow and keep the lights on, and will store that CO2 from that power station under the ground. More importantly, though, right across Scotland, Scottish industry needs to have the opportunities to decarbonise, not only to reduce carbon from its current emissions, but also to provide pathways to the products and services which you're going to need in the future in a low-carbon world. And, of course, Grangemouth is a key part of that. We're lucky in Acorn and the Scottish cluster that there's already an existing pipeline which links St Fergus down to the central belt. It allows options to tie in all of Scottish industry to a CO2 network and provides a future to that decarbonised way of the world of tomorrow. From a Grangemouth point of view, as you said already, hugely important employer, long history in Scotland, and of course what we want to do is find ways to extend the life of that site and to create the products we're going to need for tomorrow. Acorn plays a critical role in that. We help to decarbonise the existing production, saving tens of thousands of jobs, but also we provide a pathway to the future. We can create CO2 networks so that we can create green products for the future, and that's a critical part of what Project Willow is all about.
Yeah.
So I think there's lots of reasons to be positive about the Acorn and the Scottish cluster. We are embedded in the heart of the industrial future for Scotland, and we really want to make this a success.
Interestingly, today, so we're recording on Wednesday, the 26th of March, ahead of the spring statement by the Chancellor at Westminster. But today, the Aberdein and Grampian Chamber of Commerce has approached politicians across party divides to back the idea of immediate action to try to fast-track the Acorn project. And it seems as though it's getting a decent level of cross-party support. Is that your sense, that actually there is political will for this thing to be accelerated?
Absolutely. I mean, we very much welcome. There's been a number of engagements across the business community in Scotland and across the UK, actually, in making the case for the Scottish cluster and decarbonisation programmes in general. We're delighted to see the letter today. Comes on the back of other similar letters we've had from business leaders. And I think it is really important that we find a way to make Acorn happen. It does look as if there is strong cross-party support. There's been lots of positive support in Holyrood, and our engagements down in Westminster have also indicated a strong level of cross-party support. Of course, I suppose we have to recognise that that it is difficult fiscal times for the UK, but this actually is about making investment. It's not actually about subsidies here. It's about investing in growth, and that is a key part of what the government is trying to deliver here. We not only safeguard the present, but we provide the pathway to the future. And so I'm finding ways to make this sort of investment happen is exactly what the Chancellor should be looking to do with her spring statement and of course, comprehensive spending review over the summer.
I suppose, Andy, if I can get your take on this before we get more from Nick, this could be, politically, this could be what we've been talking about quite a bit on the pod, which is something of a win for Anas Sarwar from a Labour government at Westminster that could reframe the perception of him when it comes to industrialisation or deindustrialisation in Scotland.
Yes, and it's a no-brainer, really, I think, for Anas Sarwar to support this for all sorts of reasons, because it combines a variety, well, I think 3 important attributes that Anas Sarwar needs to demonstrate. 1, that he's on the side of jobs and employment. 2, that he understands what the transition to net zero means. And 3, that he can offer a Scottish line, that he can be, in the phrase we've used before, I suppose in relation to Andy Burnham when we talked about it, but in the phrase we used before, so that he can be Mr. Scotland. Because at the moment, what Anas Sarwar is suffering from is being Labour's man in Scotland rather than Scotland's man in Labour. So, I mean, this is a complete no-brainer for him to do, and I think he should grab it with both hands. And the more that the Scottish Government doesn't grab an issue like this, particularly in the energy area, the more that Anas Sarwar should try to do so, because he needs differentiation, he needs positive differentiation from what John Swinney and the Scottish Government are doing in all sorts of areas, including this one.
Yeah. Nick, go on, Geoff.
Well, Calum, I suppose my question for Nick, seeing as we do have an expert on, and as our listeners keep telling us, that's far from what we are. Nick, I hear some detractors of the technology saying, it's not proven at scale, this can't really happen. I mean, what's your response to that? Because I think, there is a job that needs to be done in improving the concept. And I suppose my second supplementary to that is, the reason that I think we're looking for this Scotland's carbon capture cluster to be backed by the UK government isn't just because we want Scotland to be successful, it's because they're already doing 2 clusters in Merseyside and Teesside just now. So I think that this is all about trying to prove as much as possibly can to decarbonise the entirety of the UK. So if you could take those maybe 2 questions in turn, Nick.
Well, starting off with the latter one. So yes, we're delighted to see the progress of the clusters in the UK. Obviously with HyNet and with Northern Endurance. Fantastic to see that really grasping the nettle and moving forward with delivering on a decarbonisation agenda. Really great. What we want to see that, of course, is expanded through to Scotland and provide a benefit to that for Scottish industry. in terms of the technology and the maturity of that, we have a very mature set of technologies. When you look at carbon capture, actually, it's multiple different sorts of technologies which have been proven across the globe across multiple industries on multiple parts of the world. If we start off thinking about the stores. Storing CO2 safely under the ground has been taking place for decades. A large part of that has been in the US, historically looking at enhanced oil recovery, but increasingly we're looking at using those stores for carbon capture. There's an extended program been taking place in Norway with the Sleipner field. Been going on for decades. Huge amount of scientific study taking place, and that has been safely storing that CO2 exactly as expected for decades now. So I think it's proven technology. We're reusing existing pipelines. We know that they are suitable for CO2 use. We've done lots of work around that. And if you look at the individual customers who will be capturing CO2, that their technology for capturing CO2 from their emissions is well established. Lots of different sorts of technologies being used. So I actually don't understand this argument that it's not an established technology. All we're doing is we're putting the pieces of jigsaw together, perhaps to do it on slightly bigger scale than has been done before, but it has all been done before, and we're very, very confident that we've got a really robust technological solution here.
One fascinating point of this always, Nick, is the sell, if you like, to the public, is getting people on board with it. People who might not be in the area and might not see it in reality, I suppose, but who hear us talking about it and want to understand the impact of it. And I think one thing we should consider in making it real is job creation, for example, economic boost of something like this. Can you put that into numbers and into context for us?
Yes. So the Scottish cluster, we can reach out to about 90. We can decarbonise about 90% of Scotland's industrial emissions. So one of the issues, of course, is that we do want to make our positive contributions to climate change. But I think the more important aspect right now is actually about the economic and social benefits of these sorts of projects. What we want to do, what we don't want is deindustrialization, to see our industries fade away and jobs disappear overseas. What we want is to provide routes for our industries to decarbonize, to create and to develop new jobs, and to deliver the products that we want for the future. For Acorn, we reckon that about 18,000 existing jobs will be safeguarded with the development of the project, and we will be creating about 10,000 jobs during the construction phase and about 5,000 jobs in the operations phase. So a huge jobs boost for Scotland and for the UK supply chain. What we'll be doing, of course, with these sort of projects is buying goods and services from across the UK. So not only do we deliver Scottish jobs, but we deliver benefits throughout the UK economy. And particularly, if you look at the North Sea industries, using many of the skills that are there, using the supply chains which have been providing goods and services successfully for decades now, we want to create the opportunities for them to diversify their portfolios and to provide the sort of skills and jobs and equipment and so on that we'll be needing in the future.
Nick, thank you ever so much. Thank you for joining the podcast today. Really good to get the info.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed for the chance to talk.